is the last of a set of 3 lectures where we focus on theories or models of leadership. We began by examining trait theories of leadership, then focused on contingency models, and now we turn to the topic of charisma. What is charisma? Are charismatic leaders more successful than those who lack it? And what are the pros and cons of charisma? Could there be negative or a dark side to charismatic leaders? Let's consider a few compelling examples of leaders who often have been described as highly charismatic. For example, consider Lee Iacocca. He took over at Chrysler after the government had bailed it out in the late 1970s. He offered a compelling new vision for Chrysler. He demanded and ultimately brought to market a small front-wheel drive car, the so-called K-car, pushing his engineers to develop something that was more economical in terms of using fuel. He brought out the minivan, a bold new product concept that was an advance from the station wagon of the 1970s. He reinvigorated the convertible market, bringing convertibles back to the American public. And he acquired Jeep and reinvigorated that brand, ultimately launching the sport utility vehicle craze in the United States. He used personal sacrifice as part of his appeal as a leader for this organization during the turnaround. He agreed to take on a $1 annual salary with heavy incentive compensation, which would only kick in if the turnaround was successful. In other words, I will only make a lot of money if the company makes a lot of money, if I can bring it back from the brink of collapse. He used emotional appeals, not only with his employees, but with customers. He became a star in Chrysler TV commercials, one of the first CEOs to spend a lot of time on television pushing his own company's products. His famous line, "If you can find a better car, buy it." And he exuded self-confidence throughout this time. So Iacocca, no question, was successful. He saved Chrysler at the time. He brought it back from the brink of collapse, refunded the government for all the loans it guaranteed, and was able to leave with it as a very profitable automaker. Now contrast that with another charismatic leader, Steve Jobs, the legendary CEO of Apple. Now remember, Jobs had founded Apple back in the 1970s with Steve Wozniak. And then he had been pushed out of the company he founded during the mid-1980s. He went on to become CEO of a company called Pixar, which has brought us many popular animated films like Toy Story and Finding Nemo. And then he returned to Apple in the mid-1990s. By then, its market share had dwindled to 3%. The firm had lost $1.6 billion in a very short period of time under his predecessor. Apple stock had fallen by more than 60% from the start of 1993 until the start of 1997, when Jobs became involved again at Apple, the company he founded. He offered a compelling new vision for Apple when he got there. He said, "We will be design leaders. Computers are not just about technical, computational devices. They are fashion-oriented items. They're about design. They're about user experience. They're about emotionally connecting with customers." And he offered a vision of Apple becoming a mobile technology leader, more than just about computers. And of course, that vision has materialized with the iPod, iPhone, and iPad. Emotional appeals were core to his leadership approach, much like Iacocca. Think about the phrases that we've all come to know Steve Jobs for. "It's the coolest." "We changed the way you... ... Isn't that incredible? I'd love to show it to you now." I mean, think about when he stands on that stage unveiling a new product and he's emotionally connecting to his customers. People who aren't just customers, but are truly fans of the company and its products. He, like Iacocca, engaged in self-sacrifice. When he came back to Apple, he took on a $1 annual salary, just as Iacocca did in the early 80s. Again, there was a large incentive compensation package. If the firm succeeded, if Apple turned around, then Jobs would become very wealthy. He also agreed to reduce his role at Pixar, where he had been leading the company, to take on increased responsibilities at Apple. For a time there, though, imagine that. He was actually CEO of Pixar and Apple simultaneously. two of America's most successful firms over the last decade. And of course, he did not lack for self-confidence. Many charismatic leaders are characterized by high self-confidence. And he certainly, like Iacocca, was the personal face of Apple over the last decade. And he was a major public relations star. When he became ill, it was huge news. When he didn't show up to present a new product, it made headlines around the world. So when we think of charisma, as we consider Jobs and Iacocca, we're thinking of inspiring, bold, self-confident leaders who attract many followers who believe in their clear and compelling vision. And we often think about leaders who saved an organization or a country in a time of crisis. We think of CEOs like Jobs and Iacocca. We think of national leaders in a time of crisis, like Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Ronald Reagan, who led their countries through remarkable comebacks, through times of turmoil. Well, what is charisma? We've sort of identified some leaders who seem to exude it. They're often the examples people cite when they talk about charisma. But what exactly do we mean by this word? If we go back into the academic literature, we see that Max Weber was a famous early sociologist who defined charisma and began to talk about it in the context of leadership. He pointed out that the Greek word meant divinely inspired gift. And he defined charisma as this sort of supernatural or superhuman quality that people tended to have, that ordinary people did not have. This is a very interesting way of thinking about leadership and thinking about this phenomenon that he called charisma. I'll point out others studied this as well. James McGregor Burns studied what he called transformational leadership, which people often lump together with the notion of charisma. Now, that's not necessarily the right thing to do, but the two are clearly related. McGregor Burns wrote a seminal book on political leadership, and he made this interesting distinction between transformational leaders and transactional ones. What is transformational leadership? That's when you're appealing to the moral values of your followers. You're trying to mobilize them to affect a major change in society. You're asking followers to go beyond their self-interest in pursuit of some broader, greater common good. And you're tending to focus on stimulating their intrinsic motivation, something we're going to talk about more in a later lecture. He contrasted that appeal to moral values, that focus on moving people beyond self-interest, to what he called transactional leadership. That's when you're motivating people by appealing very much to their self-interest, and you're providing benefits in exchange for their effort and their contribution. And you're tending to focus much more on extrinsic motivation, that is to say, pay or promotion or other kinds of external rewards. Now, while transformational leadership is not exactly the same as charisma, they are related. In fact, Bass argued that charisma is a key component of transformational leadership, but it's certainly no guarantee of success. Now, Weber argued that we often see charismatic leadership arise or emerge during social crises, that in those instances, a leader often offers a bold vision for how to address the crisis, and he tends to attract followers who believe strongly, fervently in him or her. If some early successes are achieved, then momentum builds as people attribute extraordinary powers to that leader. In fact, this notion that followers are attributing power and potential and capability to the leader is an important one. Conger and Kanungo proposed a theory, in fact, an attribution theory of charismatic leadership. They argued that charisma is in the eye of the beholder. It's something we attribute to others, not simply something that leaders possess. In other words, we're looking all the time to the people who lead us. We're observing their behaviors and traits. And we're also looking at the characteristics of a situation. And as a result, we're attributing charismatic qualities to certain leaders who achieve certain successful results, particularly in times of crisis. The idea here is to understand, well, why do we tend to label some leaders as highly charismatic? What compels us to see an individual as inspiring and worthy of following passionately? Well, Conger and his colleagues have attributed it. What they've said is we attribute charisma to a leader if they put forth a bold vision that's different than the status quo, yet that seems possible, feasible, can't be outlandish. If they act in unconventional or surprising ways to realize the vision, we tend to see them as very charismatic. If they're willing to engage in self-sacrifice, or if they're willing to take on personal risks, either with regard to their career or their compensation or the like, that's important in terms of seeing them as charismatic. If they exude self-confidence and enthusiasm, both for their vision as well as for the services or products they're pushing. And if they employ emotion to sell their ideas and attract followers, rather than just asserting authority and telling people what to do. All of those things tend to cause us to see people as charismatic. Now think about that list that I just cited, and then think back to Steve Jobs and Lee Iacocca. Self-sacrifice, emotional appeals, enthusiasm, bold vision, unconventional. All adjectives we could use to describe Iacocca in his turnaround at Chrysler and Jobs in his turnaround at Apple. So in many ways, their approach has these certain common qualities, and those qualities are the kinds of things that we often then look to and define as charismatic, if you will. Now, how do charismatic leaders tend to influence others so much? How do they create not just followers, but fans, devotees? Well, there's very much this effort by people like Jobs and Iacocca and Franklin Roosevelt to have people identify personally with them. What you see is that followers want to please and imitate the leader. There's very much this sort of paternalistic or maternalistic aspect to leadership in this instance. Followers are seeking the charismatic leader's approval. And followers gradually are beginning to internalize certain beliefs and values that leader holds. And the charismatic leader is not just influencing by getting people to identify with them, to see them as a father or mother figure. They're also working on the conditions in which those followers are operating. And they're trying to tap into some unease or dissatisfaction with the status quo. They're defining the situation in a way that creates a sense of crisis. So if you think about Chrysler, well, it's very easy for Iacocca to do that, right? He could say, look, we've had a government bailout. You know, if we don't do this, we're going to be bankrupt, and that'll be it. In Jobs' case, maybe not quite as extreme, but clearly the company had lost billions of dollars. Its share was at an all-time low. There were troubles. And he could point to that and point to the dissatisfaction. But it was more than just financial results. Jobs could point to the fact that, Apple had lost its mojo, its design roots, that it was no longer king of the user experience, right? And so he could appeal emotionally to say, look, aren't you dissatisfied with what Apple means, what the brand stands for today? Let's go back and recapture the magic. Similarly, Iacocca did that by saying, have we become just a financial corporation worried about numbers, and we're no longer car guys and car gals? We're not worried about producing great products anymore. Let's go back and produce great cars. And he would evoke memories of the time when he was at Ford and had created the Mustang, and when he had created other very compelling hit cars that had gone to market. And he asked his engineers to remember the energy and excitement of those days. And many of them were engineers he brought over from Ford to Chrysler when he made the move. And so there is this attempt to get people to be dissatisfied with the status quo and to want to recapture glory, if you will. So think about many successful turnaround artists in a variety of fields. Think, for example, about athletic coaching. Bill Parcells, Rick Pitino, Billy Martin, the famous manager of the New York Yankees back in the late 70s and early 80s. All turnaround artists, people who would take over struggling teams and then bring them to success. And see how very much they were attracting followers who would look at them in a very paternalistic way, that would seek their approval, that would want to do well for them. And gradually they were trying to get those players on the team to internalize certain new beliefs and values about how to compete, how to play. And they were very successful in doing that. Now note that they were successful as turnaround artists. That doesn't mean that their charismatic approach is successful in all settings. And as we know, in the case of Parcells, Pitino, and Martin, each of them also had their share of failures in their career. Well, that leads us then very nicely to the next key question. Is charisma always positive? Should we focus on the effects on followers, and might we find that there are both positive and negative effects? And can we determine if the positive outweighs the negative in all instances? House and Howell are two scholars that have looked at this question of the positive and negative effects of charisma. And they focused on values and personality to examine this question. Here's what they found. They found that there are certain negative charismatic leaders. And they described them as having a very personalized power orientation. What do they mean by that? These are leaders, these are individuals who are trying to get people devoted to them as individuals, as opposed to asking them to be devoted to ideas, to a powerful concept, to a product, to a strategy. They're also people who tend to want to garner power and keep their followers weak. And they're very much seeking self-glorification. They want all the credit. These kinds of folks, House and Howell argue, tend to have negative effects on their followers. Now, they may achieve short-term positive results for their organization, but ultimately the effect on the people who work for and with them can be negative, according to House and Howell. Now, contrast that with the people they described as positive charismatic leaders. Well, if I ask my students this question, what do you see as sort of the orientation of people that you describe as having a positive effect on their followers when they exude charismatic leadership? Well, you get some of the very characteristics House and Howell have articulated in their research. They say it's about a socialized power orientation as opposed to a personalized power orientation that the negative leaders have. This means that, what you're really seeking, these positive charismatic leaders, they're seeking that there's this internalization of values on the part of their followers, not just, this personal identification with them as a father or mother figure. There's very much devotion to ideas, not devotion to them as individuals. These kinds of positive charismatic leaders also share information openly. There's no secrets. There's no hiding things from their people. There's no hidden agendas. And they're engaging people in decision-making with them. There's very much this participative element to those positive charismatic leaders. So there's this contrast, socialized orientation, personalized orientation, and it really did make a significant contribution as we began to think about the positive and negative effects of charisma in various leaders that have been studied. Others have probed even further and really tried to understand the so-called dark side of charisma. And they've identified a number of attributes or characteristics we might look for in leaders to suggest they might be tipping from the positive side to the so-called dark side. In other words, this idea is that someone could in fact be a very positive, powerful, effective, charismatic leader, but then they may sort of go too far, if you will. And sometimes it's because they've had success. They become full of themselves. They sort of become too extreme in their approach. So they've described leaders who go from confident to arrogant, who go from bold to excessive in their risk-taking, who begin to have delusions of infallibility, who begin to go from consultative to simply suppressing those dissenting views, and who alienate their followers because increasingly they take all the credit for the success. You also see a dark side of charisma when leaders fail to develop successors, when they haven't put a good plan in place to figure out who's going to replace them. And, by the way, on that, you'll note that Iacocca's replacement, Bob Eaton, really did struggle and eventually sold the firm to Daimler, and of course that merger that he engineered was a colossal failure. You also see impulsive behavior and a failure to acknowledge and learn from failure. These are all aspects of the dark side of charisma, and they tend to emerge over time. You often see people who begin by achieving certain positive results, and then they become more extreme in their behavior. Of course, there are some examples of people who go way beyond that, and really are examples of cults of personality that have emerged. We see this particularly in political leaders, right? In those instances, we see them cultivating a certain amount of hero worship on the part of their followers. And we see it often in authoritarian or totalitarian regimes. So Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini, Mao and Ho Chi Minh, all examples of totalitarian or authoritarian leaders who had this sort of cult of personality they were trying to cultivate and drive in their followers. Now we also see examples like Jim Jones, who led that group suicide, if you will, back many years ago, also trying to cause people to worship him personally as an individual. and very much leading people to take extreme action as part of that cult of personality. So there's no question there's extreme examples of the dark side of charisma as well. Now, what about the business literature on charisma? In the 1980s and 90s, we had a great deal of attention paid to the importance of vision setting, particularly as people made this distinction between leading and managing, which we talked about in an earlier lecture. And there were many case studies written about leaders who were able to lead tremendously successful transformations, and often they were bringing organizations out of a crisis. The popular press was also beginning to focus much more on the CEO rather than the organization. More and more, the success of a company seemed to be attributed to the person holding the office of CEO as opposed to the broader management team, organizational capabilities, the culture, or the values. Rakesh Khurana is a professor at Harvard Business School who's done some interesting work on CEO search processes. How do companies hire a new chief executive? And he talks about this search for a corporate savior. That firms sometimes find themselves desperately seeking a charismatic leader from outside the organization to come in and take performance to a whole new level. And he noticed this shift that was taking place in the 80s. He said that way back after World War II, we had what he called managerial capitalism, with the organization man model of CEOs who climbed the corporate ladder largely unknown to the general public. And then he notes this shift in the 80s. He calls it the rise of the celebrity CEO. People like Iacocca, Jack Welch at GE, Steve Jobs at Apple. He points out that the cover of many business magazines like Fortune and Businessweek had very few CEOs on it back in the 60s. And yet today, almost every week, those magazines feature the face of a CEO on the cover. We have begun to identify companies with particular individuals, with celebrity CEOs. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, Khurana argues that we're falling into a trap, an attribution error. We're attributing far too much of a company's success or failure to the CEO, particularly if that leader is highly charismatic. Studies show, for instance, that the characteristics of the top team may in fact be a better predictor of company success than the characteristics of the CEO alone. And yet, we like to look to that one particular individual. I mean, think about all the attention, for example, that's been paid to Jobs' illnesses. And the whole notion is people outside the company have come to attribute all of Apple's success to that one individual. Is that really true? Doesn't he have an incredible team working with him and for him? And yet we don't think about that. We often attribute all the success to Jobs. He is the public face of the company, after all, and it's somewhat understandable. The other issue, of course, is that studies show that industry and macroeconomic effects are a major factor in determining company performance. And yet, again, we don't always account for that when we see a particular CEO who's done so well. Warren Buffett once said, when an industry with a reputation for tough economics meets a manager with a reputation for excellent performance, it's usually the industry that keeps its reputation intact. In other words, if we look in the pharmaceutical industry, which is an industry which, on average, all firms in the industry, many firms in the industry, earn high returns. The average return on equity in that business is extremely high. Contrast the pharmaceutical business with the airlines. The airline business is awful. As Richard Branson once said, it's very easy to become a millionaire. You just start as a billionaire and then launch an airline. It's a money-losing proposition. Well, is it really fair to compare a leader in those two industries? If you're in the pharmaceutical industry, even if you're a relative poor performer compared to your rivals, you're still likely to generate much more profit than any airline, even an airline that's managed fairly well. The environment is a big driver of performance. It's not really fair to compare leaders across industries in that way. In fact, research by strategy professors such as Michael Porter and Anita McGann have shown that there's wide differences in profitability across industries. You see soft drink industries making a lot of money, pharmaceutical industry makes a lot of money, and then you see things like airlines that are just dogs, very poor performers over a long period of time. So leadership is often what we look at when we're trying to understand a company's success, yet it turns out simple economic variables associated with the structure of an industry are big drivers of performance. We don't look at those. We focus on attributing success to the charismatic leader, not to the underlying structure of the industry. The bottom line is the facts show the industry in which you compete matters a great deal. Some studies have shown that 20%, roughly 1/5 of the profitability of a firm is driven by what industry they're in, has nothing to do with what leader is at the top of the organization. Now, Jim Collins is a very famous management writer who's had a great impact over the last several decades. He's produced one of the most read business books of the past few decades. It's called Good to Great. He compared truly exceptional firms who had sustained high performance for a long time to average firms in their industries. And he tried to identify the characteristics of these great firms. Now, there are certainly many problems with these kinds of studies, and I would argue there are many limitations to the Collins methodology and approach. Yet I think it's interesting to note that Collins, too, like Khurana and like Buffett to some extent, is a critic of the focus on charisma. He defines this concept he calls level 5 leadership. And it's this combination of a strong will to achieve certain results, to drive an organization to better performance, with a humble nature, with a lack of desire to take all the credit. He said this is kind of counterintuitive or countercultural. He said, you don't need to be larger than life to transform a company. And he cited many examples in his book of leaders who had successfully transformed organizations without charismatic personalities, who he viewed as humble leaders. So, for example, Darwin Smith had led a very successful transformation at Kimberly-Clark, producer of goods such as Huggies diapers. And he argued Darwin Smith was very modest and humble, not at all like many of the charismatic leaders that graced the covers of Businessweek and Fortune. Author Henry Adams has written about Abraham Lincoln that he was quiet, peaceful, shy figure. And Collins points to that and says, look at Lincoln, one of the great presidents. He doesn't look to me like the definition of a charismatic leader. So many of these critics of the focus on charismatic leadership have looked at this and said, well, one thing we might look at specifically is this sustainable? If you adopt a charismatic approach, can your organization thrive after you've left? And they look at an example like Chrysler, where the company did stumble after Iacocca left. They look at Apple, which clearly stumbled after Jobs left the first time. They ask the question, what will happen when he leaves again? They look at GE's struggles in the decade since Welch stepped down. And they ask if charismatic leadership might work in the near term, but fundamentally not be sustainable for organizations. The issue here is, how dependent is your firm or your institution on your leader? And are some leaders better at developing successors than others? This is a tough question empirically, though. How can you measure the effects of someone after their departure? Think about Iacocca and Welch. Does failure or decline in performance after a charismatic leader leaves prove that they weren't effective because they didn't develop successors? Or does it prove that they were truly extraordinary, and that's why the organization can't continue that level of performance after they've left? It seems to me that sustainability is important when we think about charismatic leaders. Can the organization thrive after they leave? But a stumble in performance, is that really an indicator that they failed as a leader? Or is it an indicator of their extraordinary powers? I simply don't know. It's a question my students love to debate. So what are some of the takeaways from our discussion of charisma? Well, clearly, I think we know that charisma is not required to succeed. We know that there are definitely examples where we see success, and we like to attribute it to charismatic leadership. We know that organizations have to be careful of how dependent they become on a particular person. We have to beware of the cult of personality that might develop. There are clearly key downsides. We want to build organizations that can thrive beyond the one person. That's clear. How to do that is something we'll explore over the course of many lectures to come. And lastly, sustainable competitive advantage means not being dependent on one charismatic leader. And so we want to understand not just the one person, but the whole team of people who are leading an organization. We're going to be exploring in this course the notion that leadership really is a shared activity. And many times this focus on charisma doesn't look at all at shared activity, but very much only looks at the one person. Historian Daniel Boorstin has talked about charisma, and he said beware of it. He looks at this phrase, representative men. This was Ralph Waldo Emerson's 1850 phrase for the great men in a democracy. Boorstin writes, is there some common quality among these representative men who have been most successful as our leaders? I call it the need to be authentic, or as our dictionaries tell us, conforming to fact and therefore worthy of trust, reliance, or belief. While the charismatic has an uncanny outside source of strength, the authentic is strong because he is what he seems to be. So Boorstin, like other critics of the concept of charisma, says there is another way to be successful. In Boorstin's case, he contrasts authentic leadership with charismatic. I don't know if that's the right dichotomy, but I certainly understand that charisma has its positives and negatives, and that there is this dark side to this view. And more fundamentally, the question is, do we attribute too much of an organization's success to the leader when they exude this charisma in their personality?